Okay, so this starts the session. Um, are you going to record this meeting? Yes, I am recording it. I just started the recording. Let me go ahead and show you some slides. And I'm going to point out a couple of things that are sort of the housekeeping of where things are during the process of taking this particular workshop, which is a beginner's workshop for network automation with Ansible. So hopefully everyone can see my deck okay at the moment. So one of the things that I wanted to show you real quick is what we're going to cover. So really, this particular workshop is more specific to network automation, but it does, even if you're not familiar or if you work in a different domain rather than network automation, this does give you some of the really good starting points to understand how to use Ansible just in general. So we'll talk a little bit about the taxonomy of a playbook, what a playbook is, and some of the contents, and how you can use it with specific network automation modules. But this would be consistent with other types of automation as well. So you'll see some synergies that you could apply to like Windows or Linux servers, those types of things. What we do want to do is cover mainly the playbook related types of workshops. So think of this as a 101 getting started. And I do have other labs that you'll have access to as part of this. If you have the interest and you want to go beyond the first 3 labs that we do today, which is about how much time we have, you can go ahead and there's 3 additional labs that go more into detail of using the Ansible automation platform. So when I teach something just relative to Ansible, then you could think of it as being applicable to either using like the Ansible core engine. So if you were to create playbooks and use Ansible playbook commands, those types of things. With this in particular, though, because we couple this together with the automation platform, I'll use the Ansible Navigator tool. And if you're not familiar with the Navigator tool, don't worry about that piece, because it's very similar to what you may have already experienced with Ansible playbook commands. So just think of it as a newer command line, but it goes a bit further than just a command line. It also has additional capabilities as far as providing you like with a menu, or what we call a TUI, a text driven menu. So when you run a playbook, you can drill into the output and create artifacts, which is like built-in logging. So some of that will be a little more apparent as we go into lab 1. But if you're not familiar with the Navigator, no worries. We're not doing anything too difficult, right? This is all beginner level training today. And one thing that I mentioned earlier before I kicked off the recording is I'm going to record this in sections. So we'll record these slides. So think of this as just a level set to get started. And then when we go into lab 1, I recommend that everyone follows along in lab 1 so that you can become familiar with the Red Hat backend lab system that you're using. And then for lab 2 and 3, you can either follow along with me, and I'll be sharing on the screen as I go through. And you may want to use like 2 different displays on your end, so that way you can see what I'm doing and then you're working in your own environment. Or if you want to just work in your own environment, you can do that. And just if you run into an issue, then just use the chat, or even better, unmute yourself and just let me know that you have an issue in case I'm not, if I miss it in the chat window, then I'll cover, whatever that question may be. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first part of this, again, is more of a level set. So I guess also before I get too deep into this, and I think the way the screen works now, I can see if you use emojis. So if you don't mind, if you're brand new to Ansible, if you could give me a thumbs up. Okay. All right. And again, this is beginner, so it's actually better in some ways because you may not have used some of the more legacy methods of using Ansible. If you have been using Ansible for a while, at this point, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. And that's okay too. It's just for these particular labs, and I don't know like where you are today, specifically with your skill set. Some of them may be like a bit easier for you. So there are additional labs that I'll show you in the slides that you can tackle as well. So there should be something for everybody. I do have a more advanced workshop, like a 201 series, and I have a multi-vendor workshop that's more of like an intermediate to expert level workshop as well. So just keep those in mind too as a future reference if this is a little too easy for you. But I think even when it's easy, sometimes we learn things regardless. So we'll go ahead and take a look more into what's in the slides right now, and then we'll come back to the lab. When we do come back to the lab, I'm going to provide you with an actual link so that you can go into each one of these labs. And these labs are set up in what we call a hot start. So a hot start means that you don't have to wait for the labs to provision. So they should be ready to go. So that way, when you start the lab, you're ready for whatever step one is, and we don't have to wait for like servers to spin up and things of that nature. One other thing just to note, I'm going to pop back into the meeting room here and move a couple things around. In the chat, I've pinned a link to the slides. So if you click on that link, it should download the same slides that I'm going to go through with you guys and download them locally. So that way, if you click on any of the other subsequent links, like to the pods and things like that, then you'll be able to do that locally on your PC, and it should work. And also just to have the slides as a leave behind as well. So these slides, I've saved them on a GitLab repository, but this link should just start to like download it into your browser. When you click on it, then you should be able to open it up in your downloads, and you'll have the same slides local to you. If that doesn't work, just speak up, unmute yourself and let me know for some reason if that's not working, but you should be able to connect unless for some reason your work computer doesn't allow you to connect to GitLab. And if that's the case, then we may have a challenge, or I could think of a different way of sharing the slides, something like that. So one of the things that I wanted to level set is really why use Ansible for automation, or in this case for network automation, and why use like go beyond that, and why use the Ansible automation platform. So think of them as one and the same to a certain point, because you can use the community, edition, open source edition of Ansible, and it's just a Python application, and it's called the Ansible core engine. And you can use that and run that on any platform that supports Python, pretty much. And you can run playbooks. Where it starts to differentiate like what you can do there versus the automation platform. The automation platform also uses the Ansible core engine under the hood. It's just that it packages it into a container, and at runtime, when we run a playbook from the automation controller, it's called an execution environment. And I guess the value there is like, regardless if you're creating playbooks using Ansible core engine. I also mentioned the Ansible Navigator, which kind of sits in between, because that is a command line tool that also uses the containerized execution environments. And then the automation platform has the automation controller, which some of you may be more familiar with the term tower if you had used it several years ago. The automation controller is now one component of several components that comprise the Ansible automation platform. So to make things easier to manage, especially when we're talking about Python dependencies with different modules and things that we need to install that are dependencies for our playbooks, along with the collection of modules that we'll talk in more detail about later, it's very easy to package that into an execution environment, and it would be the same regardless if you're running it on your laptop with a Navigator, or if you're running it on a server or OpenShift, or in the public cloud in AWS on the automation controller. So we're not gonna get too deep into that, like from an architectural perspective, but just know that that's there. So like going back to this slide, a lot of folks gravitate towards Ansible because it's very easy to get started. So if you kind of look at the middle pillar here, Ansible is simple, and I think you'll find that true as we go through these labs. They'll kind of prove themselves out. It's simple in the sense that we don't have to become like a full-blown programmer really to take advantage of the value of Ansible. And just Ansible in general, right? To use Ansible to create automation through playbooks, it's fairly easy to get started. So it has a low barrier to entry. And probably the main reason for that is because we can typically learn YAML very easily because it's more human readable. So we'll look at that in lab 1. We'll start to take a look at this YAML file that we call a playbook, and we'll talk about the taxonomy of a playbook, what are the required parameters, those types of things, and what does the YAML syntax need to be for it to be a valid playbook to run and execute the playbook. So a very simple starting point where some folks start to have a bit of like a conceptualization and maybe misconstrue some of the things about Ansible is that this whole notion of being simple doesn't mean that it prevents you from anything that you may have done in Python, because Ansible is Python. It's just the Python that we're using is abstracted where we front end everything with a YAML playbook, but behind that, when you execute that playbook, typically we're running Python modules that map to very specific use cases of something that we're working with, in this case on a networking device, that are running Python scripts in the background. And then ultimately, we're either sending command lines to that device or REST APIs. So we don't have to deal with the command line or the REST API directly. So that's where it's simple and it's abstracted, but it's still powerful because we can take these playbooks and we can still leverage everything that we can do in Python because we're not bound to just using these collections of modules. We can also use plugins. So we'll talk a bit about plugins, where plugins are really just, really all sorts of different Python code that allow us to create these different filter plugins to effectively extend Python capabilities into our playbooks. And then another layer of why it's powerful is the automation platform. So if we start to work directly with building playbooks, managing those playbooks and running them in a particular order can become quite a challenge. So sometimes we might start looking at it, from the lens of, can we create or orchestrate multiple playbooks at the same time? You can do that directly with Ansible Core Engine, but that can be very, very difficult to manage, especially when you want to create different conditionals and logic to do, like when something succeeds versus when it fails, or if you want to have integrations into other logic outside of Ansible. So that's where the automation controller makes this, system more manageable, but also more powerful because you can extend so many more features and capabilities in managing and running multiple playbooks together, or even multiple workflows together. So that's all a part of the automation controller. And I do have some labs that show how to build what we call workflows. So think of workflows more around orchestration, and then running playbooks directly is more like task level automation. And in the automation controller, we can certainly do that. Those are called job templates. But it's really the workflows is where most of the capabilities would be. As a consumer of Ansible, you would realize more of the capabilities through workflows, just because there's so much more you can do. This third pillar here is agentless. So agentless is very important to those in the network space, because a lot of times these network appliances, whether they're physical or virtual, may not have an ability to install an agent anyway, right? So because Ansible is agentless, we simply just need to be able to connect with either SSH or through a REST API connection, and then we can send serialized data in the form of pushing configs, or we can request information, from configuration state or operational state from these devices, and no agent is required. So it's one less thing to manage from a lifecycle management perspective in terms of managing our automation. So network automation, you can make the argument it is different from server automation and cloud automation, database automation, right? There's certainly things that are very specific to networking, and by things I mean use cases. So that's how we would delineate network automation from other domains. So it's really in two parts. So one part of Ansible network automation is the certified content collections, and those map to vendors. So if I wanted to automate Cisco, then I need a Cisco collection of modules that map to a particular type of device within Cisco. And the way that we delineate different types of devices in Cisco is normally by the OS that it runs. So there's iOS XE, there's iOS XR, there's Nexus OS, right? And then for more proprietary things, there's Nexus and ACI mode and things of that nature, to where there are collections of modules specifically for each one of those. So we need to know, like, what do we want to automate so that we select the correct collection of modules. And I'll double click into that because there's a notion of certified collections. There's also the community collections, and there's some additional value in the certified collections in terms of support and things of that nature. The second thing that's not bound directly to a particular vendor is more around the actual use case and how we're applying it to different types of devices. So you can see on this slide, there's a lot of different types of devices in the network space. So obviously the most apparent ones are routers and switches, but we also have load balancers and firewalls and IP address management, or IPAMs, and various controllers. So most of those are the SD types of controllers, right? SDN for data center network fabrics, SD-WANs, right? SDA, software-defined access, is Cisco design for the campus, but they all kind of work the same way in the sense that there's a controller that is like a management software, but also has some responsibility in like the control plane, or at least interacting with the control plane of a particular architecture, right? So most of these are built on that whole notion of underlays and overlays, right? And then you have a controller that's really the single touch point in terms of how you're going to configure those systems, or in a data center, configure that, that fabric as an example. So if we're talking to ACI, like Cisco ACI, or the Cloud Virtualization Portal, CVP, and Arista, right? Those are systems that manage, different workflows that manage like the fabric as one, right? So there's modules, collections of modules to communicate directly to controllers as well. So sometimes we're talking directly to the device, and in some cases, based on the architecture, there could be a controller that, for automation purposes, we talk directly to that controller. But the idea here is to interact with it in a way so that we can, through automation, extend different capabilities. So infrastructure as code is, one of those, newer paradigms where it's really built on managing change. So if we're going to make configuration changes, we should have a single source of truth. And our single source of truth could either be more driven from like the repository side of things, like a Git repository, and that's typically labeled GitOps, or it could be driven more from like the controller itself. So if the controller is the single source of truth, then we need interaction between what we're going to build through Ansible and doing checks against the state of the config using integrations or modules that we have with those particular types of devices. So if I was going to make a change like in Catalyst Center or ACI or something along those lines, I would have the ability to check the existing configuration and make sure that my intended configuration that I'm declaring as part of my Ansible configuration is consistent. And if it's not, then I would want to resolve that. And typically we call that configuration drift checks. So these are all things that work. Really, they're not, any particular vendor. There's really, no particular proprietary piece of that. It's more in general. And the nice thing is that it does, in infrastructure as code, it makes it an easier paradigm for us to work with multi-vendor in that regard. So here are some of the types of use cases that we could apply, and again, it doesn't matter what type of vendor. These are just typical use cases that we see over and over again in the network space. One of the ones that comes up a lot is because Ansible is a configuration management tool, and we may have a proprietary or a legacy tool that does some aspects of configuration management for particular types of network devices. But perhaps, as you're trying to normalize and make that consistent across all different types of devices, you may want to leverage, Ansible for things like backups and restores, like of configs, upgrading firmware on devices, or managing certificates, right? So that's another use case that comes up a lot, primarily like on the REST API side of things. But you may have a network, that is built on the actual configuration of devices, like network routers and switches, like using netconf or something like that, or RESTconf router rather, and needing to manage certificate rotation for those purposes, or for VPNs or whatever the case may be. Scope configuration management is very important, because even if we have a solution that can do like a config backup and restore, typically we're not pushing like monolithic complete configurations to these devices. Normally, when we're building something in a network space as part of that architecture, we're building it in layers, right? Because it makes sense to like build like the underlay, ensure that you have a consistent configuration that maps to your baseline, as well as validating the operational state as you go through, right? Because you may want to bring up, OSPF or BGP as part of the underlay, test it between sites, things of that nature, before you start building an overlay on top of it. So like in the WAN, like if it was a layer 3 VPN, you would build MPLS, and then that would be an overlay. Or if it was VXLAN, you would, EVPN configurations, right? That would need to be solid, right? And then you have your VXLAN overlays. So you would want to deploy them in like a more scoped configuration. And that's what Ansible does through resource modules. Resource modules map to very specific configurations. So not the entire config, but something very specific like BGP or OSPF, VLANs, those types of configs where it's a very particular, specific scope of what you're configuring. But then you can roll back just that configuration, or you can replace just that configuration. And that's where we will look at resource modules. So those are very important. Some of the other things that we do that are probably like the lower risk items is dynamic documentation. So there's a notion of facts, or gathering facts is kind of a generic term that used to only work against servers, but it also works against network devices. But in particular, depending on the type of device, we would want to use a module that's a part of specific collection. Like if it was iOS XE, we would want to use the iOS_facts module, and then we can actually create very specific subsets of facts that we want to learn. And think of these facts as being the configurations that come back as structured data. And then once we have that configuration state, it could either be used to populate, some level of documentation like markdown files, or create reports or dashboards, those types of things. Or it could be used as criteria that we can use to check against for compliance. And then taking that a step further, we could, go back to our scope configs and actually make specific changes if we need to remediate something, due to a compliance issue, those types of things. This last part is network validation. And this is where it's very important to understand that everything that you're configuring in a device, you still have access to that operational state. You may be able to access it directly, or at a minimum through a show command, you can have a response that comes back right? And that response could either be something that's true or false or present or not there. Think of things like interfaces being up or down, or a network prefix that exists or doesn't exist in a routing table. We can use those to check our configuration changes, right? To ensure that we have the expected outcome in our environment after making changes. So those are very important, and you'll see those validation and operational checks used a lot when we start to build like full-blown pipelines of making like more end-to-end changes that we run through our staging environments and things like that. But that's stuff that's further out. So I don't want to muddy the waters with too much of that kind of thing, since we're staying more at the beginner level. But in our labs, we'll see aspects, certainly of scope configs and infrastructure awareness through dynamic documentation. We will look at facts a bit, and we will look at the resource modules. So having said that, I just want to make sure that we get through these slides here, and then we'll get right into the labs. So this is just to give you a sampling, just to note that, like, regardless what vendor you're using, more than likely there's coverage in Ansible for said vendor, right? So this is just a few, like a representative sampling of some of the main vendors that we work with. And again, this is across, all the different types of network devices. And there's other things on here that aren't represented as well. But pretty much most of the best of breed, you should find them as certified collections. And at a minimum, if they haven't gotten that far yet, you should at least see them as part of Galaxy. And Galaxy is the community content that's out there. So it's still collections of modules. It's just the certified collections go through a bit more rigor. And that's what this slide alludes to. So think of the certified content as a collection of modules, right? So it's modules, and it's basically you want to automate something in particular, right? So you know what you want to automate, so you need to go find that module or that collection of modules and make that available for Ansible so that you can run playbooks that call these modules. So the thing about certified is that it goes through additional rigor. It has additional requirements for, like, documentation and testing and things of that nature. And it's available through console.redhat.com to pull them down directly, or to your private automation hub, which is a component, one of the components of the Ansible automation platform. Again, a lot of these are available on Galaxy, but when you have issues, the difference would be that if something's not working in a particular community edition of a module, you can go to the GitHub page and you can log an issue. And then there's various contributors, right, that maintain those. You would be able to subsequently ask them for help, but it's not like having a support ticket. And that's kind of the advantage is, through the support ticket, you would be able to drive escalation and things, where Red Hat would be providing triage and working with Cisco or Juniper or whoever the case may be. Another important aspect that we haven't talked about is called Ansible validated content. So certified content are collections of modules. Validated content are collections of roles. So what a role is, and we'll talk about this a bit more on a slide for one of the labs, a role is actually like a purpose-built playbook that has a directory structure that's made to be shared, right? So it lends itself to sharing, and it's set up such that most of the tasks that are needed that map to a specific use case have been completed for you. It's just that you're simply providing, parameter or defining parameters as variables, right? So it's variabilized that you can iterate through, and then you would be using that particular role as your playbook, right? So you might have like a playbook that kicks off the role, and I'll show you an example of that. And there's different ways of doing that, but effectively the role is where the meat of the task are, right? So that'll make a bit more sense when we get into it. But at the end of the day, what it does is it allows you to create like a playbook that does the thing that you want it to do very well, and then you can make that shareable so that other people on your team or even outside your organization don't have to continually create a playbook that has all that logic. They can just call the role, and then the role would be very easily consumed. So validated content are roles that we work with our ecosystem to say, if you want to automate this particular solution, then here's the recommended roles to use to make that happen. So you don't have to do a lot of playbook development and things like that. If you're building something in particular, and a lot of our initial content around networking are things like if you're building BGP or OSPF configs, there's a lot of things that you'll do that are the exact same regardless of the vendor. And you would go in a particular order, and there's certain validation that you would do. That validated content would provide you a mechanism to kind of do most of that out of the box, right? Where you're just changing your variables and maybe tweaking it very minimally, right, for your environment. So a lot of these things allow you to get up and running in a prescriptive way very quickly. So here's a brief for Lab 1. So we'll go through a few more slides here, and then we'll switch gears to actually get into the pods. So one of the things that that we want to do, and I mentioned, is just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the contents of a typical playbook. So a playbook really has 3 categories. So think of a playbook, again, just at a high level. It's a YAML file, right? And it's a way of like a machine creating a file that's a machine definition file. And in a playbook, we can have one or more plays. So we'll take a look at that on the next slide. And then we're typically calling a module. So to have access to a module, we package those into a collection, and then we make that collection available in an execution environment if we're using the automation platform or Ansible Navigator, right? So all the content that we need is installed into this EE. And then from that, we have a path or a namespace that provides a path to that code so that we can use it in our playbook. And if our playbook requires tasks to do things that go beyond what those modules can do, we can extend capabilities by being able to call filter plugins. And there's also other types of plugins, but think of them as being extra code that's written in Python that do things that, outside of what the module does. It's because the module's purpose is really mapped to something very specific. And then a plugin could extend capabilities, like if I wanted to convert JSON format to YAML, as an example, or other types of either data manipulation or finding data, like select attributes and mapping. Those types of things allow us to find data, manipulate data, create files, stuff like that that we may need to do as part of our workflow. So here is like a basic Ansible play. So again, this is just a YAML file. And because it's YAML, we start with the 3 dashes, right, to show that it's the beginning of a playbook. And then we have the name parameter, in this case, configure VLANs. And this name is very descriptive and to the point, if you will, of what we're going to do in the playbook, right? So we're going to configure some VLANs. Hosts, what this means is that we're pointing to an inventory. So on the next slide or so, we'll show an example of an inventory. An inventory is where you list various groups that contain like the targets or potential targets of your automation. So host in this case is pointing to a group called switches. Gather facts or gather underscore facts is true. What this means is what I was alluding to earlier with the dynamic documentation. If you turn on gather facts, it really depends on what you're connecting to in your inventory. So initially it was more for like if I connected to a server with particular OS, it would need to run Python. We would connect to it, and any of the information on that remote server, we would gather facts about its current hardware and software state. So information around the CPU and interfaces and the like, that information would come back as facts, and it would be loaded into memory so that we could use it in our playbook as logic, right, for any of the tasks that are a part of that play. So that's, this is at the play level, at the high level of the playbook. Gather facts in the network context, what it does currently is if we're connecting to a network device, it will gather the default facts. And the default is like a show ver, if you're familiar with Cisco, where it's just like very basic information, like the actual serial numbers and the version of code that's running. It's not a whole lot of configuration information. It's just the default comes back. And that's what you get from at this level. If you want more than that, then there's an actual, like an iOS underscore fax or iOS XC, or I'm sorry, iOS XR or Nexus, right? We just have to point to the correct collection and what type of fax that we're pulling down based off of the devices that we're connecting to. So once we define like the play, then what the play needs to have is a task. So the next thing that you don't see here is we would have task and a colon. And then under task, we can have multiple tasks that are pointing to modules, right? So those are the way that you would list them out, right? If you had more than one. And even though you do have one, it's a list element, right? So it starts with a dash. So in YAML, that is the syntax. When you have a list, each one of those items would be, delineated by a dash. And you'll notice that there's indentation, right? So the first part of this is the name of the task. So this task is a VLANs task. And then we have a namespace that we point to have access to that module. So the first part of it in this, what we call a fully qualified collection name, is the vendor. So it's Cisco. And then through dotted notation, the next part of it is the name of the collection, Nexus OS. And then the third component of this is the name of the module, which is VLANs. So guess what? The only thing you configure with the VLANs resource module is very specific VLAN configurations like IDs and VLAN names. So here we have a config parameter, and we're just configuring two VLAN IDs. So the name is optional. So, but if we wanted to have a VLAN name, we could have incorporated that parameter as well. Now, to understand what parameters are available for a particular resource module, then you go to the documentation. And there's documentation for each module, and it'll show you all of the available parameters in the documentation, or you can look at it locally in your Ansible Navigator, and I think the lab will get into that. Now, here's a plugin. So this is that extra code, right? So if we had a module for VLANs or a module for interfaces, what we may want to do is manipulate some data and use one of the available plugins. So in this particular example, we've created a key value here. So the key is my underscore subnet, and the value is this 192.168.1.0/24. But using that particular value in my playbook, I may not want, in this case, I may not want the actual network and prefix, right? So I might want to split that up. So that's what a filter typically does, is it allows us to manipulate something. So we call that variable, my subnet, and then it's a filter is always, this pipe is indicative of the start of the filter. So this is a filter that's called IP adder. And then what we're doing here in the parentheses is we're saying we just want to see the network. So it'll render just the 192.168.1.0. And if we just wanted to see that prefix for the net mask, then we do the same thing. We just call the prefix instead of the network, and then we'll just see the 24. That's what's rendered. So there's all sorts of different plugins. It's just one of the many plugins, but it's more for typically like for how you want to manipulate the data when you're creating something like a report or something, visualizing something or using logic to do something in like another task that's further down. Here's an inventory. There's two ways of building an inventory. This is the INI format, and there's also the YAML format. So in INI format, we just use these open braces to create groups. So we have a group of web servers, a group of databases, and a group of switches. And then underneath them, we have the actual host, right? So there's two web servers, one database, two switches. And you can use fully qualified domain names, or you can use whatever names you want. But if they don't resolve, then as an option, you have an Ansible underscore host parameter that you can set that has the IP address. But if your DNS is already set up, then you can certainly use whatever you want in your inventory, as long as something is resolving it. And then here's a role. So we talked about that validated content, where it's these these roles that we're creating that do something very particular that makes it a lot easier, right, than creating our own playbooks. So in this example, we're calling a role in the playbook, right? So we have the name in the playbook, the host to these web servers, and then these two roles that it's calling. So what would happen here is it would read in this backup role and this build report role and do the task that are in that role and then stop. That would be the end of the playbook. Another option that I like is include roles. There's also import roles. So that way you can actually import or include them anywhere in the playbook and do things before and after including the roles. So maybe there's certain, tasks that you want to run, like pre-task, and post-task is another way of organizing that in the playbook. Run things before and after roles. But if you just, here you're installing the role. So it just does what the role does, and then that's it. Which may be what you're looking for. It just depends on what you're trying to do in your playbook when you call a role. Now, to point to the role, it's using the namespace. So this namespace was network. When we talked about the modules, we were talking about vendors. So when you're creating roles, you create a namespace. So you start with that. And then toolkit, right? So that's the collection, because it's a collection of roles. And then the name of the role, in this case, is backup. So when we install those as a collection into our EE, we can just access them through this dotted notation. You can also create roles that you save them in folders in your project from where you run your playbooks. And then you can point to those paths, or you can point to a repository, like a Git repository, as a path to find the roles. But at the end of the day, you need to locate where that role is in order to use it in your playbook. Lastly, this is a collection. A collection could have roles or it could have modules. So modules is more around the certified collections, and roles will be more around the validated content. But you can certainly create your own roles and turn those into collections that you store in your private automation hub. You also can include in a collection playbook examples, various plugins. Another popular plugin is like an inventory plugin. So you can create like a dynamic inventory that pulls out host and IP address information from a particular system, which is a popular type of plugin. And then all the testing and documentation that's available for that module or role would be available in that collection as well.